On January 15 and July 29, 1966, two military coups changed Nigeria forever. They brought an end to the First Republic and the country's first military rule. These coups deepened ethnic divisions, led to widespread violence, and set the country on the path to civil war. 60 years later, these events remain among the most misunderstood and controversial chapters in Nigerian history. In this episode, we'll examine what happened before, during, and after the January and July coups. First, what led to these military coups? A few years after the British had taken over the territory that later came to be referred to as Nigeria, Lord Frederick Lugard, the then governor of northern Nigeria, signed a document consolidating the two protectorates, that is, the southern and northern provinces, thereby creating the colony and protectorate of Nigeria on January 1, 1914. The British had only one thing in mind while carrying out the amalgamation: for economic reasons and administrative convenience, thus making the union a sham, so to speak. With the foundation laid, the new colony continued to grow and develop with agitations by Nigerian nationalists for an independent state. In response to this and the demands for independence, successive constitutions legislated by the British moved Nigeria toward self-government on a representative and increasingly federal basis. In 1954, the colony became the Autonomous Federation of Nigeria. By the middle of the 20th century, the great wave of independence was sweeping across Africa. By 1958, the British had agreed to yield to the demands of independence. After being under British rule since March 5, 1862, Nigeria gained its independence almost 100 years later in 1960. Those who played key roles include Benjamin Nnamdi Azikiwe, Ahmadu Bello, Obafemi Awolowo, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, amongst others. In 1963, Nigeria became a federal republic with Nnamdi Azikiwe as the country's first president. As of 1963, Nigeria was a diverse country with so many ethnic groups. It was not a surprise that at some point, certain groups began to feel marginalized and cry out for proper representation in the corridors of power. With its high population mass and larger geographical allocation compared to other regions in Nigeria, the North seemed to have dominated the government from the very beginning, having won 134 out of 312 seats in the first parliament under the Northern People's Congress (NPC). The Igbo-dominated National Council of Nigerian Citizens (NCNC) party had followed behind, garnering 89 seats in the parliament, while the Action Group AG, which represented mostly the Yoruba people, got 73 seats. Within the period, agitation began to arise about the unequal distribution of power across the federation, backed by allegations of corruption, anarchy, and rigged elections. The 1964 elections came up just after the leader of the Western region, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, was tried and imprisoned for treasonable felony, conspiracy, and possession of firearms. To the disappointment of many Westerners, Chief Samuel Ladoke Akintola won the October 1965 Western regional elections amidst political violence and alleged rigging. Chief Akintola was seen as a puppet and a willing tool in the hands of the Northerners, as he was the leader of the newly formed Nigerian National Democratic Party (NNDP), which many considered to be in close relations with the NPC. Refusing to accept this electoral verdict, many of the political thugs in the western region resorted to violence in varying degrees, including arson, protests, and murder. The situation came to be known as Operation Wetie. This gruesome event in the West has been described as one of the triggers for Nigeria's first military coup, which was led by Majors Emmanuel Ifeajuna in the south and Patrick Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogu in the north. By August 1965, the plan for the coup was formed and the recruitment of officers who shared the plotters' ideology commenced. Now, let us take a look at the main players of the January coup. Although there had been rumors of a coup in the wake of the mayhem ongoing in the western region, nothing significant happened until the cold morning of January 15, 1966. Those who actively carried out Nigeria's first military coup include Emmanuel Ifeajuna, Kaduna Nzeogu, Adewale Ademoyega, Timothy Onwuatuegu, Chris Anuforo, Don Okafor, Humphrey Chukwuka, Emmanuel Nwombosi, Ganiyu Adeleke, John Atompera, Fola Oyewole, and Ben Gbulie. One persistent myth is that Nigeria's first military coup was led by 5 Igbo majors. The "we were 5 in number" comment that Kaduna Nzeogu made in an interview in May 1967 after the coup is the source of this myth. The 5 majors myth was later perpetuated by Captain Ben Gbulie's book on the coup, Nigeria's 5 Majors, which he admittedly based on a BBC play of the same name. Nzeogu's infamous "we were 5 in number" remark made no mention of the rank of the 5. He was simply referring to the coup's 5 designated strategic regional commanders. Interestingly, 9 majors were originally scheduled to take part in the coup. Majors Nzeogu, Ifeajuna, Ademoyega, Okafor, Anuforo, Chukwuka, Obienu, Onwuatuegu, and Chude Sokei. Shortly before the coup in January, Chude Sokei was posted abroad. Obienu failed to show up on the day of the coup, leaving 7 majors as participants. When it came to the coup's execution, the majors designated 5 officers as regional commanders. They were Nzeogu and Onwuatuegu in the north, and 3 more in the south, which made up Nzeogu's "we were 5 in number" comments. In the south, the head of the Lagos operations was Major Emmanuel Ifeajuna. That makes 3 majors so far. The squad that assassinated Chief Samuel Ladoke Akintola in Ibadan was led by Captain Emmanuel Nwombosi. That brings us to 4, 3 majors and 1 captain. There was no coup in the Midwest because no military formation was stationed there. Lieutenant Jerome Oguchi, however, was dispatched to the east to arrest the premier of the eastern region, Michael Okpara. The identity of the 5th member is the most difficult to determine. Majors Don Okafor and Adewale Ademoyega were given a lot of responsibility for the Lagos branch of the coup, and one of these 2 men was most likely the 5th commander, or it could have been Oguchi himself. There appears to have been some debate among the majors about whether to kill the target personalities or not. There was disagreement as some wanted all targets to be shot without exception, while others insisted on no blood being shed. However, they could not agree on whether some people should be killed or not. This issue was therefore left to the judgment of the officers. As a result, this decision proved unwise. It appears extraordinary that for such a sensitive operation, such as whether to take or save lives, such a major decision was left to the discretion of individual soldiers. Without strict predetermined parameters, Such an operation would inevitably result in random executions, giving rise to the appearance of tribal killings. Some characters in the plot maintained a consistent approach. Majors Anuforo and Nzeogu appear to be among those who made predetermined decisions to kill their targets, while Major Chukwuka appears to be among those who did not wish to harm their targets. Major Onwantuegu and Captain Wobosi were inconsistent in their approach. We will discuss this fully in the next part. In the early hours of January 15, 1966 in Kaduna, Major Kaduna Nzeogu, just like every other night, led the soldiers on the exercise Damisa, just a few meters to the lodge of the Premier of the Northern Region, Sir Ahmadu Bello. The true aim of the exercise was to indeed carry out what would become Nigeria's first military coup. When they got close to the Premier's lodge, Nzeogu then made the true purpose of the exercise clear to the soldiers. They were to eliminate the Premier. They then broke into the lodge by firing at it, but Bello could not be found. Enraged, Major Nzeogu searched for the Premier frantically until he eventually found him among his wives and cries of little children. Without thinking twice, he shot him dead. Other casualties in this exercise were one of Bello's wives and a loyal bodyguard who both tried to shield the Premier from gunfire. In Lagos, Majors Emmanuel Ifeajuna, Humphrey Chukwuka, Don Okafo, and Adewale Ademoyega ran the show. Ifeajuna led some group of soldiers to Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa's house where he was arrested. Although it was not in the original plan to assassinate the Prime Minister, Balewa was reportedly shot and killed when it became apparent that the coup had failed. Ifeajuna also carried out the killing of Lieutenant Colonel Abugo Lagema, who was the commander of the 4th Battalion in Ibadan. Lagema had been a guest at a hotel in Ikoyi when he was lured out of his hotel room to the lobby and was gunned down by the major. Lieutenant Colonel David Ejo, the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion in Enugu, had also been a guest at the party and a target for the coup plotters that night as well, but he narrowly escaped death by a last-minute change of hotel room from the one initially booked for him. On the night of the coup, a party was being held in honor of Brigadier Mai Malari. Some other senior officers in the army were in attendance. Lieutenant Colonel James Yakubu Pam was abducted in the presence of his wife and children and killed shortly after by Major Chris Anuforo. Major Anuforo was also responsible for the deaths of Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Chinyelu Unegbe, Colonel Kor Mohammed, and Minister of Finance Chief Festus Okotie Ibo. The Premier of the Western Region, Chief Samuel Ladoke Akintola, had heard rumors of the coup the day before and tried to warn Sir Ahmadu Bello, but to no avail. He was at his home in Ibadan when the wife of his deputy, Chief Remi Fani Kayode, who had already been arrested, called Akintola to warn him of the impending danger. Not long after, a group of soldiers led by Captain Emmanuel Nwombosi arrived at the Premier's lodge. Immediately, Chief Akintola opened fire and defended himself. He was eventually killed by the captain and his men. By the time the coup plotters stopped firing, only one of the army's high command was still alive and well, Major General Johnson Thomas Aguiyi-Ironsi. By the end of the coup, about 22 lives had been brutally gunned down. Among them were Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, Ahmadu Bello, Samuel Ladoke Akintola, and Festus Okotie Ibo. The president, Nnamdi Azikiwe, was abroad on medical leave at the time of the coup and thus survived. Nwafor Orizu, the acting president while Azikiwe was away, also survived. Shortly after the coup failed, the rump cabinet of Tafawa Balewa tried to choose an acting prime minister in the person of Zana Bukar Dipcharima, but Orizu did not give any approval. However, after a meeting with Ironsi, Orizu announced at 11 p.m. on January 16, 1966, that the cabinet had handed over the reins of affairs to the military. The next day, Monday, January 17, 1966, Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi officially took over the leadership of the country. He established a Supreme Military Council and thus began the first military regime in Nigeria. The First Republic had come to an end. But who was the main leader of Nigeria's first military coup? Since 1966, Major Cardinal Nzeogwu has been hyped as the leader of Nigeria's first military coup. This has been widely assumed as a result of Nzeogwu's visible role during and after the coup. The Major was the only one to carry out the coup successfully in his chosen target's region. Following his victory, he delivered his infamous speech over the radio. As a result, the false belief that he was the coup leader circulated. Nzeogwu was not the leader of Nigeria's first military coup on January 15, 1966. As a matter of fact, he was not brought into the conspiracy until the coup plot reached the logistical stage. Major Emmanuel Ifeajuna was, no doubt, the brain behind the coup. He was an Onitsha-born Igbo who served as a brigade major in Lagos. A well-known international athlete who held the Commonwealth record for high jumping, the Major was also a graduate of the University of Ibadan, where he studied zoology. Ifeajuna later wrote a manuscript outlining his reasoning for believing a military coup was necessary. This manuscript was never published. When Ifeajuna realized Ironsi was rounding up those who had participated in the coup, he disguised himself as a woman and fled to Ghana, leaving Nzeogwu in charge of the operations. The rumor that Nzeogwu was the leader thus persists. Some argue that Nzeogwu's involvement in the January 1966 coup was part of a grand Igbo plan to dominate the country. This argument ignores the fact that Nzeogwu was an Igbo only in name. Major Nzeogwu was born in Kaduna, the capital of the northern region, to Igbo immigrant parents from Okpana, present-day Delta State, then in the Midwest region of Nigeria at the time of the coup. His family and military colleagues referred to him as Kaduna because of their attachment to the city of Nzeogwu's birth. Kaduna Nzeogwu wore northern mufti when he was not in his army uniform and frequently referred to himself as a northerner. Nzeogwu spoke Hausa, the lingua franca of the northern region, like a local. The Major's command of the Hausa language was superior to his command of the Igbo language. So, what possessed a moralistic young man like Nzeogwu to assassinate the nation's most powerful northern politician in the dead of night? Nzeogwu's logic is chilling in its simplicity. To get rid of corrupt ministers, political parties, trade unions, and the entire clumsy apparatus of the federal system. What is certain is that Nzeogwu harbored anti-government sentiments for several years before January 1966. Colonel Ralph Shodende, Nzeogwu's boss at the Nigerian Military Training College, had previously reported the Major to Army headquarters for allegedly disseminating anti-government messages to junior officers. According to Shodende's reports, Nzeogwu was attempting to poison the minds of these junior officers against the government. Even though the January coup was widely termed an Igbo coup, it was stopped by Igbo officers. Interestingly, those who foiled the coup were Igbo senior officers. Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, Lieutenant Colonels Emeka Ojukwu, Conrad Chukwujimche Dibia Nwanwo, Alexander Atta Madiebo, and Major Alfonso Keshi. As Brigade Major, 1 Brigade Cardinal, Keshi informed Madiebo of the coup. Madiebo moved over to the brigade headquarters when Zeogu had taken over Ademulegun's seat and worked on the major. Ojukwu, commanding officer 5th Battalion Kano, stood his ground strategically and all worked with Ironsi to end the coup. Although he may have wanted an end to the MPC government, Ojukwu was not willing to work with the majors. He was at the parade ground when a telegram arrived informing him of the coup. Before he dared to tell his men, Ojukwu disarmed them, locked the armory, and sent the keys to a relative in Kano for safekeeping. Ojukwu then informed his friend, the Emir of Kano, Ado Bayero, of the event, and the two men rode in the same car through Kano streets, making a radio appeal for calm and coordinated acts of solidarity. Bayero was then taken to the battalion for protection by Ojukwu. The colonel also received orders in quotes from 1 brigade in Kaduna, allegedly from Brigadier Ademulegun. But Ojukwu was an intelligence officer not to be fooled and disregarded the orders. When Nzeogu came out and later asked Ojukwu to release funds to pay soldiers, Ojukwu refused. Captain Ude, one of Nzeogu's aides, was dispatched to Kano but was arrested on Ojukwu's orders when he arrived. So, did Ironsi know of the coup? The failure of the majors to arrest or kill General Aguiyi-Ironsi has led some to believe that he was involved in or was at the very least aware of the coup plots. Ironsi and other senior officers had become concerned about the possibility of a junior officer's mutiny in the weeks leading up to the coup. These concerns were relayed to the Prime Minister, who either ignored them or chose not to act in response. As a result, Aguiyi-Ironsi was either in on the plot and an ally of the majors, or he was on the majors' hit list but managed to escape due to information provided by Igbo participants within the coup circle. However, Nzeogu's interview with Dennis Ejindu in May 1967 may shed some light. He said that Aguiyi-Ironsi was to have been killed, but that they were not ruthless enough. Thus, Ironsi and his loyalists were able to supplant them. So, if Ironsi was part of the coup plot, why would the majors plan to kill him? Well, let's take a look at how Ironsi escaped death in that coup. On the cold Harmattan night of Friday, January 14, 1966, some of the most senior officers of the Nigerian army gathered at the home of Brigadier Zakaria Mai Malari, who was welcoming his new wife from Kano to Lagos. It was meant to be a quiet celebration, a private moment of joy among colleagues and friends. Nearly all the army's top brass were present, each accompanied by their aide-de-camp. Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, the general officer commanding the Nigerian army, was there in person. So was Colonel Kor Mohammed, the acting chief of army staff. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon was also in attendance, preparing to take over command of the 2nd Battalion in Ikeja from the outgoing Lieutenant Colonel Hilary Njoku. For a few hours, rank and responsibility were set aside. The officers relaxed, joked, and enjoyed themselves, unaware that some of the men who saluted them by day were already on the move to kill them by night. Shortly before midnight, the senior officers took their leave one after the other. Aguiyi-Ironsi left as well. At least, that was what everyone assumed. But while the others headed straight home, the general did not. Instead, he diverted to another party elsewhere in Lagos, aboard a ship docked at the Apapa Wharf. That single change in routine would save Aguiyi-Ironsi from death that night. Within minutes of the party breaking up, the machinery of the coup began to move. Soldiers loyal to Major Emmanuel Jr. and his fellow conspirators were already on their assignments. The orders were clear. The intention was that the military command should be wiped out in one decisive stroke. Because Aguiyi-Ironsi had gone to another party, he was not at his house where the coup plotters expected him to be. Bad timing had worked in Ironsi's favor. While the general was away at the Apapa party, the mutineers led by Major Donatus Okafor arrived at his official residence in Ikoyi. But when they got there, the house was quiet. Ironsi was nowhere to be found. His absence changed everything. The soldiers attempted to force their way in, but Ironsi's guards resisted them. A tense standoff followed. With their primary targets missing and resistance mounting, they eventually withdrew, leaving with their mission unfulfilled. One of the most important names on the coup plotters list had slipped through their fingers. Ironsi would survive and later fight them. By the time Aguiyi-Ironsi eventually returned home from the second party, two urgent and alarming phone calls were waiting for him. The first came from the home of Lieutenant Colonel James Yakubu Pam, the Adjutant General of the Nigerian Army. The second call came from the Prime Minister's residence. Ironsi was told that Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa had been abducted by some soldiers. In that moment, it became clear to Ironsi that this was a full-scale rebellion. The general then headed towards Ikeja, where loyal units of the army were still intact. There, he linked up with Lieutenant Colonels Hilary Njoku and Yakubu Gowon. Together, they began to organize resistance against the rebellious soldiers who believed the chain of command had already collapsed. But they were wrong. With Ironsi alive and issuing orders, the army still had a center. Loyal troops regrouped. Barracks that had not joined the uprising were secured. As daylight broke over Lagos, the balance of power shifted rapidly. The rebels, realizing that they had failed to eliminate the army's top commander, began to lose momentum. One by one, they fled the city, their coup collapsing almost as quickly as it had begun. By the end of the day, it was clear what had happened. Everyone on the coup plotters list, the officers in the army high command, had been killed. Only Aguiyi-Ironsi survived the carnage. But the general's survival would haunt him 6 months later when he was killed in Nigeria's bloodiest coup on July 29, 1966. Before we continue, if you are enjoying this deep dive into Nigeria's first military coup, you probably love to have this book, A Carnage Before Dawn. If you'd like to own a copy, you'll find the link in the description below. Now, let's return to the story. Let's look at how the July coup happened. By May 1966, Nigeria's first military coup on January 15 had been largely considered a plot born out of tribal sentiments and particularly initiated by the Igbos. Both the foreign and local media at the time were said to have fueled this notion with repeated broadcasts analyzing why the January coup was an Igbo coup. For about 3 weeks, Radio Kaduna broadcast speeches of the murdered Ahmadu Bello and Tafawa Balewa. This was believed to have stirred up tribal sentiments and negative feelings towards the South. Even though the coup failed, lives were lost, most of whom were Northerners. And to add salt to the injury, the coup plotters had neither been tried nor executed. There were also rumors that they were still being paid while in prison. The rage from the north was loud and clear, but the ruling head of state, General Aguiyi-Ironsi, was reluctant to put the rebels on trial. The Northerners feared that all of the preceding events were part of a grand plot to give the Igbos dominance of the country. When promotions were to take place within the army, 25 officers were promoted, of which 19 of them were Igbos and Midwesterners, 5 from the north and 1 from the west. Even though the promotions were found to be well deserved by the officers in question, there were already perceived notions of favoritism that would not be easily abated. To Capitol, there were accusations that Ironsi gave special preference to Southerners when assigning positions in his cabinet. The tipping point had been Ironsi's decision to do away with regionalization and to operate a unitary system of government. Aguiyi-Ironsi believed the Unification Decree 34 would help restore peace and unity to Nigeria. It was reported that the general had been advised against it earlier by several northern officials, but he ignored their advice. This further confirmed the suspicions of the northerners, and on May 24, 1966, Aguiyi-Ironsi passed the decree. Just like the Westerners had done in 1965, which earned the region the epithet the Wild West, the Northerners also decided to take laws into their own hands. As a result of the delayed trial of the coup plotters, which the North considered lenient and inappropriate, they went on a rampage, killing thousands of Igbos and other Southerners living in the North. The coup had been perceived to be an Igbo coup. These killings went on for months, starting from around May 1966 and came to a halt in September of the same year. Thousands of Igbos, ranging from 10,000 to 30,000, were said to have been killed during this pogrom. The genocide reached its peak on September 29, 1966, which had been referred to as a Black Thursday. About 1 million Igbos fled back to the east to escape the massacre. There were also retaliations in eastern cities, particularly in Port Harcourt, where the Northerners were also murdered. This also led to a large number of Northerners fleeing the eastern region for safety. Nigeria was barely 6 years old into independence, and the country seemed to be falling apart already. Six months after Nigeria's first military coup, a group of northern officers decided to oust the sitting government. This coup, popularly referred to as the July Rematch, would be bloodier than the first and would claim the lives of almost 10 times the initial number of those killed in January 1966. The code name for this counter coup was Araba, a Hausa coinage that was interpreted as "Let us separate." The coup plotters aimed to secede and pull the North out of Nigeria. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Mohammed, the Inspector of Signals, the principal plotters of the coup were about 30. The military governor of the Western region, Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi, had been playing host to Major General Aguiyi-Ironsi when they were both kidnapped from the State House and murdered. The counter-coup began on the night of July 28, 1966, 6 months and 13 days after the first coup. Despite various attempts by Ironsi to pacify the northerners, it seemed they were bent on having their pound of flesh. The coup was postponed on different occasions due to last-minute changes, but its time came when Ironsi decided to go on a nationwide tour. The mutineers had been warned not to kill the general on northern soil, and so they had to wait. When Ironsi got to Ibadan while on his tour, he was hosted by Colonel Fajuyi. Unfortunately for Ironsi, in a bid to prove that he was not showing any form of favoritism to the Igbos, he surrounded himself with northerners. His security guards consisted largely of northerners, two of whom were among the principal plotters of the coup, Major Theophilus Yakubu Danjuma and Lieutenant William Walby. The trigger for the July coup started in Abeokuta. Rumors of an impending coup had got to Lieutenant Colonel Gabriel Okowenze, commanding officer of the Abeokuta unit, who made futile attempts to rally his troops. Shortly after, Okowenze, Major John Obienu, commander of the Risk Squadron, and Lieutenant Colonel Orok were gunned down. This was the same Obienu who had been originally part of the January coup but had failed to show up on D-Day. The officers who led this attack were Sergeant Sabo Kole and Corporal Misamare Maje. Frantic calls were made to Lagos to salvage the growing mayhem, but turned out to fuel the flame as it alerted coup plotters positioned in other parts of the country. Lieutenant Nuhu Nathan, who had received the call from Lagos, alerted the coup leaders, Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Mohammed and Major Martin Adamu, who gave the go-ahead for the coup to commence in other parts of the country. In Abeokuta, Igbo soldiers were singled out and executed. The same was said to have happened in Lagos, Ibadan, Kaduna, and Kano. Ikeja had become the ad hoc headquarters of the coup, as the airport had been forcefully taken over by a team of soldiers led by Murtala Mohammed. The coup plotters had plans to secede from Nigeria and also planned to send their families home to the north using one of the British aeroplanes after the coup was over. By the next morning, a team of soldiers led by Danjuma stormed the government house. Danjuma was said to have received a call from Gowon, during which he informed the senior officer of the coup and plans to arrest Ironsi, to which Gowon had responded, "Can you do it?" and afterwards cautioned him to avoid bloodshed. Many believed that Yakubu Gowon had prior knowledge of or was secretly involved in the counter-coup of July 29, 1966. Much of this suspicion stemmed from his sudden disappearance from public view on the day the coup began until August 1, when he emerged as Nigeria's new head of state. The reported telephone conversation between Gowon and Major Theophilus Danjuma concerning General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi further fueled the suspicions. Critics argued that Danjuma was unlikely to have raised such a sensitive issue without believing Gowon was already aware of the coup plots. Questions have also been raised about Gowon's absence from Ironsi's nationwide tour. As Chief of Staff, Army, Gowon was expected to accompany the head of state. Had he been unavailable, protocol suggested that the General Staff Officer Grade 1, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Awona, should have taken his place. Instead, Gowon assigned Major Theophilus Danjuma, a General Staff Officer Grade 2 and Deputy to the Adjutant General, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Ivenso, to accompany Ironsi. That decision ultimately placed Danjuma at the center of the events that led to Ironsi's capture and death. General Ironsi and his host, Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi, were abducted alongside their aides de camp. According to several accounts, they were beaten and interrogated, with the mutineers demanding that Ironsi explain his alleged role in the coup of January 15, 1966, an accusation he denied. Ironsi and Fajuyi were then taken to a nearby bush and executed, while their aides de camp managed to escape. Days later, their bodies were discovered in shallow graves on the outskirts of Ibadan. Although their deaths were widely known, it was not until about 6 months later, after the Abure Agreement, that the Gowon regime officially announced them dead and accorded both men military burials. Meanwhile, in the east, where Colonel Ojukwu presided, the coup failed, just like in January. Despite plans to execute it in Enugu, the bloody counter-coup, however, did not see the light of day in the eastern region. Lieutenant Colonel Emeka Ojukwu, the military governor, had also been a target for elimination, but Lieutenant Colonel David Ogunewe, commander of the 1st Battalion in Enugu, accidentally got wind of the killings happening across the country and acted fast. He locked the battalion's armory and kept it under the care of a mixed tribe of northern and southern soldiers. Some northern officers, including Lieutenant Shehu Musa Yaradua and Captains Momodu Jega and Gibson Jallo, made several attempts to break into the armory, but they were not successful. Once again, like the January coup, the July coup failed in Enugu due to the proactiveness of the commanding officers stationed there. Over the next 3 days, meetings were held in Ikeja over the Northerners' call for secession. That had been their only condition for a ceasefire, to which Ojukwu had responded over a call with Brigadier Babafemi Ogundipe, Aguiyi-Ironsi's deputy, that if that is what they want, let them go. Eventually, the Northerners' call for secession was negotiated, and the coup led to the emergence of Aguiyi-Ironsi's Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, as Nigeria's new Supreme Commander and second military head of state on August 1, 1966. Meanwhile, across the north, the systematic mass killings and bloodshed against the Igbo residents and other southerners living in the region continued without stopping. This is another reminder that you should not forget to check out A Carnage Before Dawn if you'd like to know more about the January coup. The details on how to get the book are in the description.